All right, let's jump right in. What if China actually decided to blockade Taiwan? I mean, really blockade it. It's a question that's gone from a what if to a very real what now. So today we're going to break down a huge wargaming project from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's CSIS, that puts this exact scenario under a microscope.
You know, for a long time, this whole idea felt kind of distant, right? Something for policy wonks to worry about. But as the CSIS report points out, that all changed in 2022. You probably remember when then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. Well, China responded with these massive military drills, basically surrounding the island. It was like they were practicing a blockade. And suddenly, this abstract threat felt incredibly real. It just burst into the public consciousness.
But the thing is, headlines give you the drama, right? They don't give you the actual data. To really get a grip on what a blockade would mean, you have to dig deeper than just speculation. You need a proper, structured analysis. So what actually happens when you game it all out?
Well, to answer that exact question, the team at CSIS realized they couldn't just guess. They needed a solid framework, a way to systematically break down this incredibly complex military and economic chess match. So they built this massive wargaming project to try and model the crisis from every conceivable angle.
And get this wasn't just a one-and-done kind of thing. The researchers ran this wargame 26 separate times. Think about that. The goal wasn't to find the one single outcome. Nope. It was about exploring the whole range of possibilities, to really understand the dynamics, the pressure points, and where things could really go off the rails.
So, how does something like this even work? Well, the best way to think about it is like a flight simulator, but for a massive geopolitical crisis. The project basically created a whole series of scenarios to stress test how China, on one side, and a US-Taiwan coalition on the other would act and react. And they measured everything, from military losses all the way to the economic hit on Taiwan.
Okay, at the very heart of this wargame is this idea of escalation ladders. It's basically a menu of options for each side. So for China, there are 4 main moves they could make. It starts with something like a non-military blockade, using their Coast Guard to inspect ships, and it goes all the way up to a full-blown wider war. And on the other side, the US and Taiwan have their own 4-step ladder of responses, from a pretty limited defense in their own backyard to an all-out military. Now this is where it gets really interesting. You can see how those 2 ladders combine to create this whole matrix of possibilities. So you've got the US and Taiwan responses running across the top and China's actions running down the side. For example, let's say China uses a submarine blockade and the US and Taiwan respond assertively. Boom, that creates one specific scenario. And then you have the most extreme case, a full-on military conflict from both sides, way down in the bottom corner. The war games basically played out scenarios all over this grid to see what would happen.
So, after running through all 26 of those different games, some really clear patterns started to emerge. And honestly, they're pretty sobering. The CSIS report boils it all down to 5 key takeaways that give us a stark, unvarnished look at what a crisis like this would really be like.
All right, let's get into it. First up, and this one is probably the most grim finding of them all.
The report is crystal clear on this. There is just no clean, low-cost way out of this. In almost every single scenario they ran, casualties were high. Even in the lowest level games, we're talking about casualties in the thousands. And when things escalated, the US lost dozens of warships and hundreds of aircraft, mainly because modern anti-ship missiles are just incredibly deadly. And it's not a one-way street. Chinese losses were also consistently staggering, in many cases even higher than the US losses.
Okay, moving on to the second major takeaway. This one is all about the momentum of the crisis itself, how it can just take on a life of its own.
So, in the games where the teams were allowed to choose their own responses, what they called free-play games, a really dangerous pattern showed up. One side makes a move, the other side responds by upping the ante. It just creates this vicious spiral upwards. And get this, in 2 of the 5 free-play games, that spiral spun completely out of control and led to a general war. The big lesson here? It is incredibly difficult to keep a limited conflict limited.
The third key finding really zooms in on the military balance of power between Taiwan and China.
What the wargames found was pretty stark. Taiwan's own forces, they could probably handle a non-military pressure campaign, from China's Coast Guard. But the second China brought its actual military into the picture, even just with subs and mines, the whole game changed. Without direct military help from the US, Taiwan really struggled. We're talking about losing up to 40% of all ships trying to get to the island.
All right, takeaway number 4. This gets to a fundamental, physical reality about Taiwan. It's an island. And that simple fact creates a massive logistical nightmare.
Look, as an island nation, Taiwan's entire economy, its people's survival, depends on a constant stream of imports. And the war games showed that trying to use alternatives, like a massive airlift, it's just not going to cut it. You can't move the sheer volume of stuff an entire country needs by plane. This leads to two critical problems. First, you don't have enough merchant ships willing to take the risk of running a blockade. And second, and maybe most importantly, you have an absolutely desperate need for energy.
And that brings us to the fifth and final key takeaway, which flips the script and looks at this whole crisis from China's point of view.
You might think a blockade is a low-cost, low-risk option for China compared to a full-on invasion, right? Well, the war games show it's anything but a safe bet for Beijing. First off, as we already talked about, Chinese military losses were really high. But maybe more importantly, a blockade basically sounds a giant alarm for the entire world. It makes it a terrible first move if you're planning a surprise invasion, because you've just given up any element of surprise you might have had.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into that energy problem, because the war games pointed to this as maybe the single most critical weakness for Taiwan. I mean, for Taiwan, a blockade isn't just a military fight. It is a desperate race against time. This really lays out the stark timeline. According to the data in the report, Taiwan's reserves of liquefied natural gas, which is absolutely essential for its power grid, would be gone in about 10 days, just over a week. Oil lasts a bit longer, maybe 7 weeks, and coal gives them the biggest buffer, around 20 weeks. But the bottom line is brutally simple. Without ships getting through, eventually, the lights go out.
So the obvious question is, why can't the world just do a Ukraine strategy and keep resupplying Taiwan? Well, the report found that while that idea sounds good, it just doesn't hold up. Remember, Taiwan is an island. Its need for things like fuel is absolutely enormous. And in most of the scenarios they ran, the Chinese blockade was just too effective to get enough ships through to make a difference.
Okay, so after all these pretty grim findings, what's the answer? Well, the good news is the report doesn't just end with a prediction of doom and gloom. It actually lays out a practical blueprint for deterrence. And the core idea here isn't about figuring out how to win a war, but how to stop one from ever starting in the first place. It's about making a blockade look like an impossibly bad idea for Beijing.
And the recommendations really fall into four main categories. First, you got to prepare the merchant fleets. This means doing things like creating insurance guarantees so commercial ships have a reason to risk that dangerous voyage. Second, you have to harden Taiwan's own infrastructure, basically build up more energy storage to make that survival timeline we saw a lot longer. Third, the U.S. needs detailed contingency plans, so the response isn't made up on the fly. We're talking clear plans for naval convoys, airlifts, the whole shebang. And finally, preparing allies in the region, like Japan and the Philippines, to play a key role if deterrence doesn't work.
So when you look at all of this, what the war games really show us is a crisis with no easy options, no simple victories for anybody. It really suggests that, in a situation this explosive, the only winning move is not to play. The report's ultimate message seems to be that getting ready, making robust, visible preparations, that isn't about starting a war. It might just be the only real path to keeping the peace.